Do you ever wonder how quickly someone can decide who you are before learning a single fact about your life? On a quiet Tuesday morning, just after 8 o'clock, Foster's Diner looked exactly like every small roadside restaurant Americans have trusted for generations. Fresh coffee filled the air, country music drifted softly from an old speaker above the counter, and regular customers enjoyed pancakes and eggs before beginning another ordinary workday. A retired couple shared the corner booth near the front window. A truck driver finished his second cup of coffee before another long haul down State Route 17, and Linda Foster greeted every customer with the same warm smile that had welcomed people through the front door for more than 20 years. At Booth 7, two black men quietly enjoyed breakfast without attracting attention. Malcolm Reed unfolded the local newspaper while Darius Coleman slowly stirred sugar into his coffee. They spoke only a few words to each other, almost as though they had shared enough conversations over the years to understand long stretches of silence. Nothing about them suggested trouble. Their clothes were neat but ordinary, their voices remained calm, and they had already paid for their breakfast long before finishing the last pieces of toast on their plates. Then the bell above the entrance rang again. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped inside wearing his white patrol uniform, nodded briefly toward Linda, and immediately scanned the dining room with the practiced confidence of someone who believed nothing escaped his attention. His eyes settled on Booth 7 for only a second before his expression changed. Instead of walking toward the counter for his usual coffee, he headed directly toward Malcolm and Darius. Several customers noticed the change in direction and quietly looked up from their meals. Linda sensed something unusual was about to happen and watched carefully from behind the register. Mercer stopped beside the table without introducing himself or asking how their morning was going. "You two need to finish up and leave," he said firmly. Malcolm slowly lowered the newspaper and looked up with a calm expression. "May I ask why?" "Officer," Mercer folded his arms, "I have received concerns." Malcolm glanced around the diner. No one appeared frightened. No one seemed uncomfortable. The retired couple continued eating. The truck driver looked confused. Linda walked a few steps closer. "Officer Mercer," she said politely, "they have been nothing but respectful." Mercer barely acknowledged her. Sometimes people make others uncomfortable without saying a word. Darius finally spoke, his voice steady and courteous. "Have we broken any law?" Mercer answered immediately. "I do not have to wait until that happens." A heavy silence settled across the diner. Malcolm looked down at the breakfast check still resting beside his empty coffee cup before meeting the officer's eyes once again. "We paid for our meal. We are almost finished." Mercer shook his head. "I am telling you to leave now." Neither Malcolm nor Darius argued. Neither raised his voice. Neither showed anger. Instead, Malcolm briefly glanced toward the large front window where a faded blue sedan remained parked across the street, exactly where it had been when they arrived nearly 40 minutes earlier. The glance lasted less than a second before he returned his attention to Mercer, but it revealed one important truth the officer never noticed. The two quiet men at Booth 7 had come to Foster's Diner for a reason far more important than breakfast, and walking away now would risk everything they had patiently waited to accomplish. Officer Ryan Mercer remained standing beside Booth 7, convinced that his instincts were telling him the truth. Around him, breakfast continued only in appearance. Forks moved more slowly, conversations faded into whispers, and nearly every customer found themselves listening without pretending not to. Malcolm Reed looked toward Linda Foster for a brief moment before returning his attention to the officer. "We have no desire to cause a problem," he said evenly. "We simply wish to finish our breakfast." Mercer gave a short nod that carried no warmth. "That is not your decision anymore." Linda stepped closer, drying her hands with a clean kitchen towel. "Officer Mercer, I have owned this diner for over 2 decades. I know my regular customers, and I know when someone is causing trouble. These gentlemen have been coming here every Tuesday and Thursday morning for nearly a month. They are always respectful. They always pay before they leave. I have never received a single complaint." Mercer glanced toward her without changing his expression. "You may not have noticed what I noticed." Malcolm quietly folded the newspaper and placed it beside his plate. "Then perhaps you could explain what you noticed." Mercer answered immediately. "You sit at the same booth every visit. You spend too much time looking through the front windows. You barely talk. You watch people." Malcolm offered the slightest smile. People sitting near a window usually look outside. A few customers exchanged amused glances before quickly lowering their eyes. Mercer was not amused. To him, Malcolm's calmness sounded rehearsed rather than reasonable. Across the table, Darius Coleman slowly reached for the small glass jar of strawberry jam, spread a thin layer across the last piece of toast, and quietly continued eating. The movement appeared so ordinary that no one paid attention, except Malcolm. He noticed that Darius had shifted the jam jar exactly 2 inches closer to the edge of the table. It was a tiny adjustment that meant nothing to anyone else. Yet Malcolm immediately understood that another scheduled detail had just fallen into place. Outside the front windows, the faded blue sedan remained parked in the same position across the street. Its engine was still off. The driver had not stepped outside once. Malcolm resisted the temptation to look again. Experience had taught him that patience often revealed more than curiosity ever could. Mercer interpreted the silence differently. "You keep looking at each other before you answer," he said. "Almost like you are coordinating your stories." Darius calmly looked up. "We have known each other for a long time. That usually helps people communicate." Mercer folded his arms more tightly. "Or helps them hide something." Linda sighed softly. "Officer, with all due respect, there has to be a better reason than that." Before Mercer could respond, the bell above the entrance rang once more. A middle-aged man wearing a brown work jacket entered the diner carrying a folded newspaper under one arm. He smiled politely at Linda, ordered black coffee, and chose the corner booth with a clear view of the dining room. Nothing about him seemed unusual. He looked like any hard-working American stopping for breakfast before another shift. Malcolm never turned his head toward the newcomer, but he noticed the reflection in the polished chrome napkin dispenser sitting between the salt and pepper shakers. Darius noticed it as well. Neither man spoke. Neither reacted. They simply remained exactly where they were, because after nearly 4 weeks of waiting, the person they had quietly returned to Foster's Diner to observe had finally arrived. While Officer Mercer remained completely convinced that the only suspicious people in the entire restaurant were sitting directly in front of him. Officer Ryan Mercer remained convinced that every passing second confirmed his suspicions. From where he stood beside Booth 7, Malcolm Reed and Darius Coleman appeared almost too calm, and that calm only strengthened the story Mercer had already created in his own mind. Malcolm slowly lifted his coffee cup, took a single sip, and placed it back onto the saucer without taking his eyes off the officer. "May I ask one question?" he said politely. Mercer nodded once. "Make it quick." Malcolm spoke in the same measured tone that had never changed since the encounter began. "If 2 people are quiet, respectful, and have broken no law, what exactly are they guilty of?" Mercer answered without hesitation. "That depends on what they are planning." Darius rested his hands on the table. Planning breakfast was all anyone here has seen. A faint smile crossed the face of the truck driver before disappearing just as quickly. Linda Foster quietly poured another cup of coffee for the retired couple, hoping the conversation would end before anyone felt compelled to leave. Instead, the tension continued growing. Mercer glanced toward the front windows and then back to Malcolm. "You have been watching that parking lot all morning." Malcolm replied calmly. "People notice what is outside windows. That is why restaurants build them." Mercer ignored the explanation. "You keep giving answers instead of explanations." Malcolm nodded slightly. "Sometimes the answer and the explanation are the same." Across the dining room, the man in the brown work jacket unfolded his newspaper, but his attention lingered on the entrance more than the printed pages. Malcolm noticed the pattern through the reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser without turning his head. Moments later, the bell above the door rang once again. A woman wearing a gray baseball cap stepped inside carrying a reusable shopping bag. She smiled politely at Linda, ordered a glass of orange juice, and selected the only empty booth with a clear view of both the front entrance and the side parking lot. To every customer inside Foster's Diner, she appeared to be another traveler stopping for a short breakfast before continuing down the highway. Malcolm recognized the timing immediately. Darius did not react outwardly, but he quietly adjusted the position of his folded napkin by less than an inch. It was an ordinary movement to everyone except Malcolm, who understood that another piece of the operation had quietly fallen into place. Mercer saw only another subtle movement between the 2 men. "There it is again," he said confidently. "You keep signaling each other." Darius looked genuinely puzzled. "I moved a napkin," Mercer folded his arms. You expect me to believe that? Malcolm answered before Darius could speak again. Officer, sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Mercer stepped closer to the table. Or sometimes people count on others believing the simplest explanation. The room became noticeably quieter. Even the country song playing through the ceiling speakers seemed distant beneath the growing tension. Linda looked toward the clock behind the counter, silently wishing the uncomfortable encounter would end before it overshadowed another peaceful morning in her family diner. Malcolm, however, knew they had reached the most delicate stage of their assignment. The target had arrived. Another key figure had quietly taken position, and every unnecessary interruption increased the risk that weeks of careful preparation could unravel before the truth had a chance to reveal itself. While Officer Mercer remained completely unaware that his unwavering focus on the wrong two men was allowing the real story to unfold only a few yards away. The quiet rhythm inside Foster's diner had completely disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable feeling that everyone was waiting for something they could not yet understand. Officer Ryan Mercer remained beside Booth 7, unwilling to step away until Malcolm Reed and Darius Coleman left the restaurant. Malcolm calmly rested both hands beside his empty plate, while Darius glanced briefly at the wall clock above the counter. It was exactly 8:33. Neither man reacted outwardly, but both knew the schedule had entered its most critical window. The man wearing the brown work jacket still appeared absorbed in his newspaper, although he had not turned another page since sitting down. Across the room, the woman in the gray baseball cap quietly stirred her orange juice while occasionally looking toward the display of homemade pies. To every customer inside the diner, the morning continued to look perfectly ordinary. Only Malcolm and Darius understood that every person was exactly where they needed to be. Unfortunately, one unexpected obstacle remained standing between them and the successful completion of weeks of patient work. Mercer broke the silence first. You have avoided every direct question I have asked. Malcolm answered calmly. No, officer. We answered every question you asked. We simply did not give you the answers you expected. Mercer frowned. Then explain why you keep coming here twice every week. Malcolm smiled politely. Some routines become important. Mercer shook his head. Important to what? Malcolm paused for only a moment before replying. Sometimes the answer to that question cannot be shared immediately. Mercer interpreted the response exactly as Malcolm expected. So there is something you are hiding. Darius finally spoke. There is a difference between hiding something and protecting something. Mercer stepped even closer to the booth. Stand up. Neither man moved. Linda Foster quietly left the counter and approached with visible concern. Officer Mercer, please. They have not raised their voices, disturbed my customers, or refused to pay. There has to be another way to handle this. Mercer answered without taking his eyes off Malcolm. I am handling it. At that exact moment, the bell above the entrance rang once again. A delivery driver wearing the uniform of a local bakery entered carrying 2 cardboard boxes filled with fresh pastries. Linda immediately walked toward the front counter to sign the receipt. During those few ordinary seconds, the man in the brown work jacket casually removed a sealed white envelope from inside his newspaper and slid it beneath the edge of the table. Moments later, another customer quietly walked past his booth on the way to the restroom and retrieved the envelope without slowing down. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Malcolm noticed every movement through the reflection in the polished coffee dispenser near the counter. Darius caught the same exchange in the chrome edge of the pie display. Mercer saw none of it. His full attention remained fixed on the 2 black men he believed were the source of the problem. Malcolm realized the investigation had just reached the point where every unnecessary second increased the possibility that the real objective could disappear forever. He looked directly at Mercer and spoke with complete sincerity. Officer, I am asking you one final time to trust that there are circumstances you do not yet understand. Mercer answered immediately. I trust what I can see. Malcolm slowly nodded, disappointment briefly crossing his face for the first time that morning. Outside the front window, the faded blue sedan remained motionless, but inside the diner the carefully observed exchange had already confirmed everything the undercover detectives had spent weeks trying to prove, while the one person determined to remove them from Booth 7 remained completely unaware that the evidence they had waited so long to witness had just passed within a few feet of him. Malcolm Reed understood the investigation had reached the point where one careless decision could erase nearly a month of patient surveillance. The exchange of the white envelope had confirmed exactly what the investigative team had been waiting to witness, yet the operation was not complete. Evidence had been observed, but the people involved still needed to believe they remained unnoticed. That required time, discipline, and above all, the ability to avoid drawing attention. Unfortunately, Officer Ryan Mercer continued standing beside Booth 7, completely unaware that every additional question increased the risk of disrupting the final stage of the investigation. "I am finished asking," Mercer said firmly. "Both of you need to stand up." Malcolm looked calmly toward the officer without changing his expression. "Officer, I respect your authority, but I am asking you to give us just a few more minutes." Mercer immediately shook his head. "You have already had more than enough time." Darius Coleman quietly placed his folded napkin beside the empty breakfast plate and glanced at the wall clock for less than a second. 8:35. They were now 2 minutes behind the original operational timeline. Malcolm recognized the concern in Darius's eyes, although neither man spoke another word about it. Years of working together had taught them that silence often communicated more clearly than conversation. Across the dining room, the man in the brown work jacket finished his coffee and casually slipped the folded newspaper beneath one arm. Instead of walking toward the exit, he remained seated, occasionally checking his wristwatch while pretending to study the menu. The woman in the gray baseball cap quietly stirred the ice in her glass before looking toward the pie display once again. To every customer inside Foster's Diner, nothing seemed unusual. Only the detectives understood that every movement followed a pattern established through weeks of careful observation. Malcolm slowly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, exposing his wristwatch for only a brief moment. His thumb rested lightly against the side of the watch before returning naturally to the tabletop. The movement lasted less than a second and appeared no different from anyone checking the fit of a watch band. Mercer never noticed it. Linda Foster did not notice it. None of the customers noticed it. Nearly 1 mile away, however, inside an unmarked operations vehicle parked behind an abandoned feed warehouse, a secure receiver emitted a quiet confirmation tone. The supervising investigator immediately looked toward the communications specialist. "Contingency acknowledgement received," she said. "Exactly on schedule?" the supervisor asked. 3 minutes later than expected, but still within operational limits. The supervisor nodded. "Notify the nearby teams to move into their assigned observation positions. No emergency response unless requested." Within moments, several plainclothes investigators who had already been stationed throughout the surrounding area quietly began repositioning themselves toward the diner without attracting attention. Back inside Foster's Diner, Malcolm rested both hands on the table once again as though nothing had happened. Mercer interpreted the continued calm as stubbornness rather than professionalism. "You still think you can wait me out?" he said. Malcolm answered with complete sincerity. "No, officer. I believe that in a few minutes you will understand why leaving now would have been a mistake." Mercer gave a skeptical smile. "That sounds more like a promise than an explanation." Malcolm simply nodded. Sometimes the explanation arrives only after people have already decided what they believe. Outside, the faded blue sedan remained parked across the street, while inside the diner every person involved unknowingly moved closer to the moment when weeks of quiet preparation, a single mistaken assumption, and one carefully protected secret would finally collide in a way that none of the ordinary customers enjoying breakfast could possibly have imagined. The quiet tension inside Foster's Diner reached a point where every customer seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, even if no one understood exactly what it was. Malcolm Reed remained seated with the same calm expression he had carried all morning, while Darius Coleman quietly rested his hands beside the empty breakfast plates. Across the room, the man wearing the brown work jacket finished the last sip of his coffee and glanced toward the front entrance for less than a second before returning his attention to the folded newspaper. The woman in the gray baseball cap continued reading a menu she had already looked through several times. Everything appeared ordinary, yet Malcolm knew every person involved had reached the exact position the investigation required. Officer Ryan Mercer, however, believed he had reached the limit of his patience. "This conversation is over," he said firmly. Stand up and come with me. Malcolm slowly looked at him without any sign of fear or anger. Officer Mercer, I am asking you one last time to allow this morning to continue without interruption. Mercer gave a short, confident laugh. You are in no position to make requests. Malcolm quietly nodded, almost as though he had expected that answer from the beginning. At that very moment, the front door opened once again. 3 professionally dressed men entered separately, each wearing business attire that blended naturally with ordinary morning customers. One walked toward the coffee station, another paused beside the newspaper rack, and the third politely greeted Linda Foster before asking for a cup of black coffee. None of them acknowledged one another. None of them looked toward booth 7. To everyone inside the diner, they appeared to be strangers who had simply arrived at the same time. Malcolm recognized every face immediately. Darius noticed them as well, although neither detective reacted in the slightest. The senior investigator accepted his coffee, thanked Linda with a friendly smile, then calmly turned toward Officer Mercer. Good morning, officer. Mercer looked at him briefly before returning his attention to Malcolm. Please wait. I am handling something. The man nodded politely. I understand. He reached inside his jacket and produced a leather credential holder. That is exactly why I need a moment of your attention. Mercer accepted the identification almost absent-mindedly. The confidence on his face disappeared almost instantly as he finished reading it. Before he could speak, the other 2 men quietly stepped forward and presented matching federal credentials. The entire diner fell silent. Linda stopped pouring coffee. The truck driver slowly lowered his mug. Even the retired couple near the windows stared in complete disbelief. Malcolm finally reached inside his jacket and removed his own credential wallet. He handed it to the senior investigator, who briefly confirmed the identification before turning it toward Mercer. Detective Malcolm Reed, he said evenly. Darius then produced his own credentials. Detective Darius Coleman. Mercer looked from one badge to the other before slowly raising his eyes toward the 2 quiet men he had spent the entire morning trying to remove from the diner. The realization struck him all at once. Every calm answer, every request for patience, every refusal to leave had never been an act of defiance. It had been the discipline of experienced undercover detectives protecting an active investigation. The senior investigator returned both credential wallets before speaking quietly enough that only those nearest booth 7 could hear. The surveillance phase is complete. The evidence has been documented, and the exchange observed inside this diner has been successfully confirmed. Thank you, detectives. For the first time that morning, Officer Mercer found himself standing in complete silence, realizing that the people he had judged most harshly were the very officers entrusted with protecting an investigation he had never known existed. Officer Ryan Mercer remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the badges that only moments earlier had seemed impossible to imagine. Around booth 7, the quiet disbelief inside Foster's diner slowly gave way to an entirely different emotion. The uncertainty that had filled the room all morning was being replaced by understanding. Malcolm Reed calmly slipped his credentials back inside his jacket, while Darius Coleman gathered the folded newspaper from the table. Neither detective appeared interested in proving anyone wrong. Their focus remained exactly where it had always been, on completing the investigation without unnecessary attention. The senior investigator looked toward the man wearing the brown work jacket, who had suddenly become far less comfortable than before. Sir, he said politely, we would appreciate a few minutes of your time outside. The man forced a nervous smile and glanced around the diner as though searching for an excuse to remain seated. Is something wrong? The investigator answered professionally. We simply need to discuss an ongoing investigation. Without raising his voice or creating a scene, he gestured respectfully toward the entrance. 2 additional investigators quietly joined him, allowing the man to walk outside with them. The customers watched through the front windows as the conversation continued calmly in the parking lot. No one hurried. No one caused a disturbance. The operation that had required weeks of patient observation was reaching its conclusion with the same professionalism that had guided every step from the beginning. Inside the diner, Officer Mercer slowly looked back toward Malcolm. I interrupted your investigation, he said quietly. Malcolm met his eyes without anger. You did not know what was happening. Mercer lowered his head for a brief moment. That is true, but I believed I knew enough to judge the situation anyway. Darius rested one hand on the edge of the booth before standing for the first time that morning. Good investigations depend on evidence, he said calmly. Assumptions can easily point honest people in the wrong direction. Linda Foster approached the table carrying a fresh pot of coffee, even though no one had asked for another refill. I have watched both of you come here twice every week, she said with a gentle smile. You were always polite, always patient, and always respectful. I never imagined there was something this important happening right here in my diner. Malcolm smiled warmly. That was exactly the reason we chose this place. Everyone felt comfortable enough to behave naturally. Linda nodded slowly as everything finally made sense. The repeated visits, the quiet conversations, the same booth, and the careful attention toward the front windows had never been suspicious behavior. They had been the routine of experienced detectives protecting an undercover assignment. A few moments later, the senior investigator returned inside and quietly addressed Malcolm and Darius. The exchange has been fully documented, and the evidence has been secured. The operation is officially complete. Malcolm thanked him with a simple nod. Around the diner, conversations gradually resumed, but they carried a noticeably different tone. The truck driver smiled respectfully toward the detectives before returning to his breakfast. The retired couple quietly complimented Linda on her choice of regular customers. Even the woman who had been sitting in the gray baseball cap briefly exchanged a knowing smile with Malcolm before leaving through the side entrance, revealing without a single spoken word that she had been part of the carefully coordinated surveillance team all along. Officer Mercer watched each detail unfold with growing humility, realizing that the two men he had questioned throughout the morning had never once responded with hostility despite every opportunity to do so. And that realization became far more powerful than the badges they had revealed because it taught him that true professionalism is often measured not by authority, but by the patience to let truth speak before judgment ever does. The last of the federal investigators quietly left Foster's diner after confirming that the operation had concluded successfully, and the familiar sounds of breakfast slowly returned to the dining room. Coffee cups clinked gently against saucers. Country music filled the background once again, and conversations gradually resumed, but everyone inside understood they had witnessed something they would remember for years. Malcolm Reed remained standing beside Booth 7, while Darius Coleman neatly folded the newspaper that had served as part of their routine during nearly a month of surveillance. Their work was complete, yet neither detective behaved as though they had accomplished anything extraordinary. Professionalism had never required applause. Officer Ryan Mercer took a slow breath before walking toward them. The confidence that had defined his voice earlier that morning had been replaced by quiet reflection. He stopped a few feet away and spoke with complete sincerity. Detective Reed, Detective Coleman, I owe both of you an apology. Malcolm looked at him calmly. What are you apologizing for, officer? Mercer did not hesitate. I judged both of you before I knew who you were. I convinced myself that my assumptions were facts. I spoke to you with suspicion instead of respect. The diner became quiet once again as several customers listened. Malcolm nodded thoughtfully before answering. You did not know our identities, and that was intentional. Undercover work depends on remaining unknown. Mercer lowered his eyes briefly. Not knowing your identities does not excuse the way I treated you. Darius stepped forward with the same calm expression he had maintained all morning. Every officer faces moments that require quick decisions. The important part is remembering that evidence should always arrive before conclusions. Mercer accepted the words with genuine humility. That lesson will stay with me for the rest of my career. Linda Foster walked over carrying a small white bakery box tied with blue ribbon. I know you already paid for breakfast, she said with a warm smile. But these fresh blueberry muffins are a thank you from everyone here. Malcolm smiled politely. Miss Foster, you have already shown us more kindness than you realize. She laughed softly. Then let me do it one more time. Malcolm accepted the box with sincere appreciation. Nearby, the truck driver walked over and shook both detectives' hands before heading toward the door. Thank you for protecting people without anyone even realizing it, he said simply. The retired couple followed, wishing both detectives safe travels. Even customers who had never spoken to Malcolm or Darius before leaving that morning offered respectful smiles instead of curious stares. The change in the room was impossible to miss. Earlier that morning, assumptions had filled the diner. Now respect had replaced them. Before leaving, the senior investigator quietly returned for one final update. The individual we observed has agreed to continue cooperating with investigators, he said. The documents exchanged this morning match the evidence collected during the previous surveillance period, and the investigation will now move forward through the proper legal process. Malcolm thanked him with a nod. Weeks of patience had achieved exactly what they had hoped without unnecessary confrontation or disruption. As the investigators departed, Officer Mercer held the front door open for Malcolm and Darius. It was a small gesture, but one that reflected a much larger change. Malcolm paused before stepping outside and smiled politely. "Officer, every day gives us another opportunity to judge people more fairly than we did the day before." Mercer returned the smile. "I intend to remember that every time I put on this uniform." As the detectives walked toward their vehicle beneath the clear morning sky, Linda watched from the front window, quietly realizing that the most important thing left behind inside her diner was not the completed investigation, but the lesson that genuine character can only be discovered after people choose to look beyond appearances and allow truth the time it deserves. 6 weeks later, the familiar bell above the entrance of Foster's Diner rang once again just after 8 o'clock on another quiet Tuesday morning. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the dining room exactly as it had for years, and the first rays of sunlight stretched across the black and white tile floor. Life in the small town had settled back into its comfortable routine, yet one thing had quietly changed forever. The framed photograph hanging beside the register now showed Linda Foster standing proudly between Detective Malcolm Reed and Detective Darius Coleman, smiling beneath the words, "Kindness begins before judgment." Regular customers often paused to admire the picture, and newcomers almost always asked about the story behind it. Linda never mentioned confidential investigations or undercover assignments. She simply smiled and said, "Those two gentlemen reminded all of us that respect should come before assumptions." The lesson never seemed to lose its meaning. Officer Ryan Mercer had changed as well. Fellow officers gradually noticed that he spent more time asking questions before reaching conclusions and more time listening before speaking. He still carried the same badge, wore the same uniform, and patrolled the same roads, but his approach to people reflected the lesson he had learned inside the diner. Whenever he met someone for the first time, he remembered the quiet breakfast that had completely changed his understanding of how easily appearances could mislead even experienced professionals. Across the state, Detective Malcolm Reed and Detective Darius Coleman had already moved on to other assignments, each requiring the same patience, discipline, and professionalism they had demonstrated at Booth 7. Official reports documented that the investigation connected to Foster's Diner had continued successfully through the legal process after the surveillance operation confirmed the exchange investigators had spent weeks monitoring. For Malcolm and Darius, however, the most meaningful outcome had never been recognition. It was knowing that they had completed their responsibility without compromising their principles, even while facing misunderstanding and unfair judgment. One crisp autumn morning, another assignment brought both detectives back through the area. Before continuing their drive, they decided to stop at Foster's Diner for breakfast. The moment Linda saw them walk through the front door, her face brightened with genuine happiness. "Booth 7 is ready," she said with a smile. Malcolm laughed softly. "I was hoping nobody had taken it." Darius looked toward the framed photograph beside the register and smiled. "Looks like we became part of the history of this place." Linda poured fresh coffee into 2 familiar mugs before saying, "Some people leave behind memories. You left behind a lesson." A few minutes later, Officer Mercer entered the diner for his morning coffee. This time, he recognized the detectives immediately and walked over with an easy smile. "Good morning, detectives," he said warmly. Malcolm stood and shook his hand. "Good morning, officer." Mercer glanced toward Booth 7 with a grin. "I figured I should ask first. Are you here working, or can I safely assume you are just enjoying breakfast?" Malcolm smiled. "Today you do not have to assume. Today we are simply 2 customers enjoying Miss Foster's cooking." Everyone laughed, and the moment felt wonderfully ordinary. As breakfast came to an end, Malcolm paid the bill, Darius thanked Linda for another excellent meal, and the detective stepped outside beneath a bright blue sky. The diner slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the lesson remained for everyone who had witnessed that remarkable morning. True character is never revealed by appearance alone. Respect is strongest when it is offered before judgment, and justice begins the moment people choose to seek the truth instead of assuming they already know it.